30-year history stopped. Real wages stopped rising in the United States. And it was a trauma. And like all psychological traumas, it is only worse if the trauma is not recognized as such by those suffering from it. And the end of rising wages in the United States was a double trauma because there was no public debate about it, no generalized consciousness about it, and a determination politically to avoid coping with it. Therefore, all American workers cope with it on their own as an individual problem. How do I solve the problem that the real wage doesn't go up anymore when I expected it would, when I promised my children it would, when those of us in professorial departments implicitly promise our graduate students that there will be jobs for them? All those things collapsed. So American workers solved it as an individual problem. They did basically two things. First, they did more work. If you don't get more per hour, do more hours. That way you can keep on consuming even though your wages don't go up anymore. Today, the average number of hours worked by an American worker is 20% more than the average in Western European countries of comparable industrial development. So when you go to Europe to enjoy the lovely dinners and relaxed life of the French and Italian working class, this is nothing cultural. They don't work 20% of the time that you do. Of course they have time to take it easy. You don't. Unfortunately, this didn't solve the problem. True, we sent old people back to work, we sent young people out to work, and above all, we sent American women who had not gone into the labor force before out by the millions to try to compensate for this trauma. And it turned out that when the women went out to work, they needed, of course, a different set of clothes. Given the absence of a reasonable public transportation system in the country, they needed a second car. And the costs of this extra work undid the net income flow. So the American working class took the second step you have to take if your wages don't go up, but you have to consume more because that's how you identify your own personal success. They went on a borrowing binge, the likes of which no working class has ever seen before. Whereas before, when you borrowed, you gave collateral for your home, we needed in the 1970s to invent all new mechanisms of debt. So we invented the mass credit card, unsecured debt that could be unloaded onto the working class at a pace that no one had ever seen before. So the last 30 years were a period of very strange economic development. Rising consumption without rising wages. Producing at the end of these 30 years the following condition of the working class in the United States. Number one, it's physically exhausted by the work it does. Number two, the amount of work done, particularly by the women who used to hold the glue, hold the family together in as much as it did, those women are exhausted doubly. They can't do the job inside the family they did before, so that we have not only exhaustion of our working class, but we have a level of personal, emotional stress in the household that is catastrophic. The genius of the Republican Party over the last 30 years has been that it has spoken to that issue. The Democrats couldn't figure it out. So the Republicans are concerned about family values, of course, and rightly so, with very good effect. And finally, the American working class, exhausted and stressed, is anxiety-ridden about a level of debt which we now know it can't sustain. That's an extreme situation. Let's quickly look at the other side, business community. There the news is good. Over the last 30 years, the productivity of labor has risen almost continuously. The statistics, by the way, released this morning by the Bureau of Labor Statistics at 8:30 this morning, indicate a growth in productivity even faster than the one that I'm referring to over the last 30 years. Productivity rose fast, much faster than wages, which stopped rising altogether. The gap between what the worker delivers to the employer, that's roughly what productivity measures, and what the employer pays the worker, got larger and larger. Over 30 years, flat wages, rising productivity. A business school dream, a fantasy come true, a level of profitability that you couldn't imagine. And of course, the capitalists, the boards of directors of corporations, had to invent explanations other than the one I'm giving you, which comes out of Marxism. So they invented the idea that it was their entrepreneurial genius, which then had to be rewarded by the kinds of bonuses and pay scales that we've seen in the last 30 years we never saw before. They paid themselves instead of the workers. Even better example of the stunning capability of this system was when the business community took its enormous profits and lent them to the workers. That's where the money came from that they could borrow. For 30 years, instead of paying workers rising wages as compensation for their rising productivity, our capitalist class lent them the money, which they then had to pay back with interest. At this point, if I had the time, I'd play the national anthem for the sheer effect of it all. During these 30 years, the working class and the business community reacted to this extraordinary period of American history: flat wages, rising productivity. With the money that the business class got, they purchased the American political system, lock, stock, and barrel. There hasn't been a shift to the right. There's been a purchase. The business community the working class, exhausted, stressed in the ways I told you, withdrew from politics. The best story about that is a book by a Harvard professor named Bob Putnam called Bowling Alone. It's a book about the withdrawal of the American working class from public participation in anything, but particularly politics. So the political system is purchased with the money that the workers produced for their wages not going up as their productivity did. And in the end, of course, the result was predictable: an exhausted, tapped out working class, unable to sustain the debt it's built up in this situation. And a capitalist employer class, having spun completely out of control by a level of profits, stimulating the speculation that is typical, that blows out of the water as its fantasies of endless profit increases lead them to take wild risks, to imagine that there's no cost to the risk, to invent insurances for the risk that couldn't possibly work, the credit default swap lunacy of our time. And here we reach then a point where our capitalist class is as exhausted by its speculative frenzy, its stock market explosions, as the working class is for it.